How many people do you think one patient could knock unconscious just by lying still on a hospital bed? Pick a number. Actually, commit to it. Drop it in the comments right now before you hear the real one, because the real one is going to bother you. The real one is 23. On the evening of February 19th, 1994, paramedics wheeled a 31-year-old woman named Gloria Ramirez into the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital in Southern California. She had advanced cervical cancer. Her heart was racing, her breathing was shallow and irregular, and she was barely conscious. For an emergency room, that is a Tuesday, so the staff did what staff do. They gave her sedatives. They tried to bring her heart rate down. They shocked her chest. And somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary emergency, the details started going wrong. The first thing anyone noticed was her skin. It had a faint, oily sheen to it, like she had been rubbed with something. Then there was the smell. People standing near her mouth described it as fruity, almost garlicky. A nurse named Susan Kane drew blood from her arm, and when she pulled the syringe back, she caught a whiff of ammonia coming off it. She passed it to a medical resident, Julie Gorczynski, who held the tube up to the light and saw something drifting around inside. Pale, manila-colored crystals. Blood does not have crystals in it. That is sort of blood's entire thing. Susan Kane said the room went sideways, and then she was on the floor. Gorczynski, still holding that syringe, went pale, walked to the nurse's station, sat down, and fainted too. Maureen Welch, a respiratory therapist, dropped next. Then another, then another. Staff were folding onto the tile of their own emergency room in the middle of a resuscitation, while the woman on the table was still, technically, alive. Somebody made the call. Riverside General evacuated its entire emergency department into the parking lot. Patients, gurneys, drip stands, the lot, out into the California night. A skeleton crew stayed inside with Gloria and kept working. At 8:50 that evening, they stopped. She was gone. The county then arrived and sent investigators into the room in full hazmat suits, which is a wonderful precaution to take an hour after 37 people have finished breathing in there. By the end of the night, 23 of that 37 were sick. Headaches, nausea, burning eyes, shortness of breath. 5 of them were sick enough to be admitted to the hospital they worked at, which must be a very peculiar feeling. Julie Gorczynski got the worst of it by a distance. She spent weeks in intensive care. She stopped breathing on her own. Her liver inflamed. And then her knees began to die. The condition is called avascular necrosis, and it means bone tissue quietly stops receiving blood and starts rotting from the inside. She was a healthy woman in her 20s. She walked into that shift and she left it on crutches. So what was in the room? Here is where the story turns, because the first official answer was nothing. Riverside County's investigators tested the air. They tested the room. They tested the equipment. They found nothing. And they concluded that the 23 sick staff were suffering from mass sociogenic illness, mass hysteria. The theory runs like this. An unusual smell, a stressful situation, one person faints and everybody else's brain quietly fills in the rest. The symptoms spread through the room the way a rumor spreads through a school, which is a deeply polite, deeply scientific way of informing 23 medical professionals that they had made the whole thing up. It landed about as well as you would imagine. Mass hysteria is a real phenomenon, and it explains fainting rather neatly. It does a considerably worse job of explaining a doctor's knees dissolving. So the case went upstairs. It went to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, an institution better known for nuclear weapons than for hospital gossip. And a team of forensic scientists there, led by Patrick Grant, built a chain of chemistry that goes something like this. Gloria was dying of cancer. She was in pain, and there is reason to believe she had been managing that pain herself at home with a compound called dimethyl sulfoxide, DMSO. DMSO is an industrial solvent, a degreaser. It is also a folk painkiller. You rub it on your skin, it passes straight through as though the skin were a suggestion, and it has one famous, unmistakable quirk. Within minutes, it leaves a garlic taste in your mouth. Remember the smell. Step 1. Her kidneys were failing, so the DMSO had nowhere to go. It built up. Step 2. Oxygen. Every patient in an emergency room gets oxygen, and DMSO plus oxygen becomes DMSO2, better known as dimethyl sulfone. Sulfone is a solid at room temperature. Cool the body down, and it drops out of the blood as crystals. Manila-colored crystals. Step 3 is the step that emptied the building. Add 2 more oxygen atoms to dimethyl sulfone and you get dimethyl sulfate, DMSO4. It is a colorless liquid that evaporates into a faintly minty vapor. It blisters skin, scorches lungs, wrecks the nervous system, and it was seriously investigated as a chemical weapon during the First World War. At no point in my chemistry education did anyone mention that a home remedy sits 2 oxygens away from a war crime. And the theory does something clever. It explains the disappearance. Dimethyl sulfate breaks down within hours on contact with moisture in the air. So by the time anyone thought to test the room, there would be nothing left to find. It explains why the people who leaned in over the body were destroyed, and the people out in the parking lot were completely fine. It explains the sheen, the garlic, the ammonia, the crystals, and the collapse. All of it in one clean line. There is exactly one problem with it. Nobody has ever managed to make step 3 happen. Not in a body, not in a laboratory, not on purpose. There is no established mechanism by which dimethyl sulfone turns into dimethyl sulfate inside a living human being. And while investigators did find sulfone in Gloria's tissue, sulfone turns up in perfectly ordinary people who have never touched DMSO in their lives. It is in your blood at this moment. It is also in coffee. So the leading scientific explanation for what emptied an American emergency room is a chemical reaction that has never been observed to occur anywhere. But that raises a stranger question. If the theory is unprovable and the hysteria verdict is unbearable, then what does the family do? Gloria's family refused the hysteria verdict. 10 weeks after she died, her body was exhumed for a second autopsy. By then, the tissue had degraded so badly that the examiners struggled to work with it at all. They recorded her cause of death as cardiac arrhythmia brought on by kidney failure caused by cervical cancer. Cancer killed Gloria Ramirez. That was never once in doubt. What emptied the room was left blank. She was returned to the ground in an unmarked grave, and she stayed in an unmarked grave for years. A woman who exists in the medical literature under a name that nobody would ever choose for themselves: the Toxic Lady. Quick thing, since most of you watching are not subscribed, it takes 1 second, it is free, and it helps a tiny channel like this one a genuinely absurd amount. Do that, and then let us finish this. Here is what I keep circling back to. Every person in that room was trained. Every person did their job correctly. The nurse drew the blood. The resident held the syringe up to the light and looked closer, because looking closer is the entire profession. They leaned in. And whatever was in that room took 23 of them down for it. Nobody has ever proven what was in that syringe. Nobody has ever explained why Julie Gorczynski's bones died. And nobody has ever produced the substance that supposedly did it. So, 23. That is the number you were guessing at the start of all this. And you were probably close, and it does not matter, because the number was never the mystery. One woman did not knock down 23 people. Something in that room did. And more than 30 years later, the most honest answer anybody has to the question of what it was is a shrug, in a lab coat, in an empty room that smelled faintly of garlic.